So, in the following three lectures, we are going to cover three very crucial topics which are interrelated. One is to understand the contemporary characteristic of the contemporary Indian folk and minor art with some examples. We have been watching quite a few examples which are very relevant. They are based on traditional themes. At the same time, we have also observed that that had added a lot of modern elements into it. But now, talking about this traditional theme and modern element may make it very superficial unless we go slightly deeper into the different layers of it and evaluate it from a qualitative perspective. So, in the next step of our discussion, we are also going to evaluate them in their qualitative aspects. And then finally, we are also evaluating and moreover seeing quite a few of the examples of the recent works by the individual artists, because individuality was not there in the tradition, and this is a fairly new phenomenon to come up with an individual artist into a community and practicing a community skill which is traditionally a community skill, and also having some kind of a visual identity that is closely related to that, adhering to the old and traditional conventional norms in terms of the stylistic identity of the image making, at the same time coming up with a real and pure expression which is uh, very individual in its characteristic. That is quite a challenge, and it has evolved through many different factors during many different ages. So right now, when we try to see the general characteristic, how the face of the contemporary practice is in our country's context, then there are quite a few things that may appear to all of our minds. That is, the painters now who belong to the traditional communities, they are exposed to global dealing. It the tradition no longer is confined or restricted to the peripheries of trade, temple, and court, but it has spread and it has a very different outreach. That has made it all the more important in today's context. There are modern artists, the contemporary artists who are trained in academic skills. They're also getting drawn into the stylistic aspects of folk painting, and there are cultural exchanges that are happening. There are researchers who visit the places, and they try to interview the folk painters. They make videos, they make short films to document all this cultural knowledge as part of the knowledge preservation activities. The works are collected and preserved in the museums. So it has some ethnographic value. At the same time, the anthropologists, they're also taking a keen interest into it. And moreover, they're liked because of the quality that the paintings they hold in their expressionistic aspects. They reach out to common people. They're liked by many. The expressions are simple, at the same time, highly complex in its traditional root. So, these are the things that will quickly come into our mind. That is how we look at it. But it's also true that, as we know, that in the beginning of all this happening, art and utility, aesthetics and utility, they were not separated as entities, but it has just happened after the growth of mass production, industrialization, and urbanization, that art has got separated into these two aspects. We look at aesthetics and utility very separately in today's time. So, folk art or minor art, the other kind of habitual art practices, they obviously, for obvious reasons, they may also no longer act as utilitarian or aesthetic purpose. It's more like the utility is in the hand of industries. So we do not really need people to produce craft or art or whatever it is which is related to the daily rituals and ritualistic practices, daily activities, the daily life. It no longer depends on the creation which is done in a small quantity by hand. Or it's just done as the cottage industry anymore. So it's taken care of by small scale and large scale in industries to a large extent. So what we do now is that all this cultural skill that are available in many people, we try to nurture that, and they're just surviving for the purely aesthetic and expressionistic purpose. It doesn't have anything to do with the utility anymore. So, to justify the use of these paintings is not possible if we bring the utilitarian aspects into the entire topic. It's very important for us to look at it from another perspective and evaluate it accordingly. It's also true that we see the artists are encouraged to make utilitarian products from time and on. Sometimes they're asked to draw on umbrellas, on bags, on lampshades. They're making lifestyle products using their skills. They're painting on saris and many other images are painted on utilitarian goods. But that has got nothing to do with the actual utility of the product. These are basically to beautify all those useful articles that we use on a daily basis. So it's not that the artworks are not getting associated with utility to get a better market or make it more sellable. But this is also true that it doesn't depend on that only. And it's also equally relevant that if we keep on depending on the market to develop the artistic expression, it may cause something a little damaging to a culture. So, when we talk about cultural preservation, there are different ways to do that, and we'll come to all those things after we discuss the different aspects, after we get accustomed to the basic profile of it. We also are in a position to evaluate it in its qualitative aspect, and then slowly, as we say, that we would also recognize the individual talents, the individual expressions that is coming out, identify the artists and give them the right status that they deserve. So I'll again coming back to a quote from K.G. Subramaniam here in the context and try to see it in an academic perspective. The method of three-folded analytical study of semiotic, iconic, and thematic aspects can be aptly applied in the study of contemporary folk painting. The tradition of narrative folk paintings emerged and grew in remote and isolated locations, but they are not confined to the temples and rituals anymore because of the cross cultural exchanges. They're rich as artistic expression and potent enough to amalgamate and evolve with time. So, G. Subramaniam writes, today's art galleries come forward to request artists to do something new. Paint in the circular or miniature format, design furniture or costumes, even wear the latter and walk around. This set them all kinds of odd themes to respond to in art magazines. Art advisors of various kinds prognosticate the trends of the future. Curators stipulate what will go and what will not on the global art scene, and the themes and devices that can give one access to its attention. He adds further that all this can be seen as a tendency of an effort to make of art an industry and force it to perform the dictates of the taste of the time. Whatsoever the intentions may be, it is interesting to view that such efforts are being also carried out to bring the regional folk painters to the forefront. So, even according to K.G. Subramaniam, there is one positive aspect to it. When we ask a folk painter to paint something of some relevance that may not come from their own choices, but it surely states one truth, that those people are approached and not anybody is coming forward and is able to proliferate that particular message with their artistic expression. So, this is very crucial to realize that why the folk artists or the minor artists are approached to do so. And somehow by doing so, they're slowly coming to the forefront. So, we may criticize it negatively from one aspect, that some of the ideas are forced on them. Of course, it's possible there are tendencies to distort history. But it's equally relevant to see that whatever is getting counted is also part of the history. And the contemporary history, the history of the present time, is also very relevant in that aspect, that it's not very easy to make the folk painters agree to do something. So, we have discussed about all these things in the past, that folk painters are very free spirited all over the globe. And it's not really easy to make them do something without their consent. So, this is for sure that they have their consent when they act out with the subject matters. So, we'll see some more works and realize that. So, in 2010, a large scale group exhibition organized by Devi Art Foundation in New Delhi, titled Vernacular in the Contemporary. Now, there's two words, vernacular in the contemporary. They're very interesting to put together, and it's very well can be made out that it took the organizers a lot of time and effort to come down to this solution. Why they're using the term called vernacular for folk and minor art? It's an effort to redefine the way we call it. And also, like in the beginning of the lectures, I mentioned quite a few things, that when I call it folk and minor art, I also wonder that why we are calling it so. This is for obvious reasons, that the terms are associated to the kind of profile that it has, but the associations can also be highly arbitrary. So, in that way, to make it more logical, more pragmatic, Devi Art Foundation's show is that has made a very prominent mark to the people who take interest to the folk and minor art. So they are insistently calling it vernacular art. Now, vernacular art is one term which is connected to the religious language. So that's a parallel language, and it could have been the mainstream language, but somehow it's because of the socio-political condition and also the economic structure that has played a vital role to make it a slightly it just got pushed back, what it was not supposed to be done. But instead of taking those romantic notions, we can just concentrate on the contemporary feature of a traditional art. That itself gives us a contradictory statement, that if something is a traditional form, then how can it has a contemporary feature? So all our discussions are now going to be concentrated with these issues. So it was curated by Jackfruit Research and Design and led by Annapurna Geramala. The first part of this project aimed at working, and the part 2 were 3 aimed at working consciously and reflectively. These are the principle. Now, I'll quote from Annapurna Garimela's writing in 2010 in the exhibition catalogue, which is very relevant for this topic, that she says that we felt some parameters for ideating were necessary, since it would be difficult to ensure an even platform without actually building one. Prior to meeting each of the artists in Bangalore, we sent them A3 size sketchbooks of archival paper. We wanted standardized sizes so that everyone's ideas occupied the same real estate plot in the exhibition. A noble intention, but one that needed to be adjusted several times over. So it was not an easy task. As we said, the folk artists are free spirited in nature, and although they are obliged to the daily customs, rituals, and many other things, but to be commissioned or to be guided by the external sources are not easy. That is for them. So, contemporary scene of folk paintings noticeably differ from its early phase in some way. The folk artists today do not and are not allowed to practice in isolation. They are being perpetually cultivated as assets for the nation. The artistic sensibility of them is now being intellectual nurturing that seldom focuses on the required nourishment of the practice. Therefore, it is time to pivot on grounded solutions as how the attention could be shifted from the ethnomaniac preservation of a culture being solely guided by the urban fascination for exotic art or exotic images to a culture of conscious and serious critical appreciation of the artworks which they actually deserve. So these are some conscious effort by some of the publisher and writers, like namely Geeta Wolf, who has tried to engage the folk artists, the eminent folk artists who had the potential to work flexibly. She actually made them tell stories. She modified them and made it more accessible to everybody, because the localized thing made it sometimes, especially when we talked about the term vernacular, that has some limitation, that it doesn't have a total outreach. So, to make it more expanded and reachable to the common mass, her efforts are quite significant in today's time. And perhaps she's one who could understand the basic lingo and the ethos of the contemporary folk art, and she used all those images in the book illustrations. So there are numerous publications in the same line, and they're uh, initiated mostly by Tara Books, but there are other publications also. The Tulika Books and other people are also coming forward and doing similar things. Now, it's very important to look at these efforts from another perspective, that initially when we go back to the tradition, we see that the folk and minor artists, they were already equipped with this particular skill of illustrating images. So, all their imageries that they made, they executed uh, in the form of paintings, they had a strong literary base. So, all those artworks were based on some strong and well known literatures. Also, the patterns and motifs that they came up with, which were connected to rituals, they also maintained a strong principle. So, they always adhered to a strong principle and found out the right elements of visual art to support that. It was there in their practice already, and with that, perhaps it was easier for them to shift their paradigm to book illustration. We'll talk about many other different kinds of paradigm shift in terms of animation and illustrations and other efforts, but I'll just see, I'll introduce you with quite a few books that are there, which are also found in the market. So, a few successful initiatives from recent times where the eminent folk painters of contemporary India took part that needs to be mentioned here are Moina Chitrakar's Sita's Ramayan, Dulari Devi's Following My Paintbrush, Swarna Chitrakar's The Patua Pinocchio and Monkey Photo, T. Balaji's Mangoes and Bananas, Radhashyam Rawat's The Circle of Faith, Rambharas Jha's Waterlife, and many more published by Tara Books. Having written in English and also translated in other foreign languages now, they have crossed the limitations of vernacular communication.